Okay, I think we're good to go. So yeah, once again, hello everyone. My name is Sarah Kingham and I'll be hosting the webinar for the next 45 minutes or so. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar on understanding online retailer formats for success on the digital shelf, hosted by myself at My Digital Shelf. It's my pleasure to be joined today by Richard Gentner, who's the e-commerce manager at General Mills. Richard has been leading e-commerce capability development at General Mills for over 2 years and has previously held various positions in shopper, consumer insights and marketing. Richard, hope you can hear everything okay?
Yes, I can. Happy to
Great,
be here.
thanks. Great. And it's also my pleasure to be joined by Keith Anderson, who's the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Insight at Profitero. He leads the continuous innovation and development of Profitero's e-commerce analytics solutions for brands and retailers, helping global companies gain a deeper understanding of their online presence to optimize both online and in-store sales. Welcome to the webinar, Keith.
Thanks, Sarah.
So during this discussion, we'll be looking at how you can define and measure success at the digital shelf, how you can approach distinct online retailer formats, and also some of the trends we predict for grocery and CPG this coming year. This will help you to ensure that your brand is winning in its category in the online channel in 2017 and even beyond. I'd like to remind you that you can send in your questions and comments using the webinar chat room feature. There'll be time at the end for Keith and Richard to answer some of the most interesting questions. And if you'd like to directly email me and ask any questions at any point, I can also forward them on to Richard and Keith at a later stage. I would also like to remind you that I'll be sending you the webinar recordings and presentations early next week. So keep an eye out for an email from me next week in case you'd like to share it with any colleagues. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard and Keith, who will be co-presenting throughout the webinar. So over to you guys.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to Richard for collaborating with me on today's session, and to all of our attendees for your patience and flexibility. Forgive us for some of the technical challenges that we had last time, and for coming back this time. We may have some surprise guest presenters today. As some of you may know, I'm based in Boston, where we're hunkered down for Snowmageddon, and so I'm delivering today's webinar from home. And I have two very noisy household members, Otto and Evelyn. So apologies in advance if either of them tries to contribute. As Sarah highlighted, there really are three objectives we have for today's session. We want to give you a point of view on how to define and measure success at the digital shelf, and importantly, how to approach different online formats or different online business models differently, so that you can align with each of your retail partners and optimize your effort to drive performance accordingly. And then we'll spend a few minutes talking a little bit about where we think things are headed and how you can remain agile and keep adapting as the landscape and your customers evolve. And I think we wanted to start just by posing the question, what is e-commerce? And it's a question that we imagine most retailers and certainly most brands have had to grapple with internally as they set out to establish an e-commerce strategy and define what success means in e-commerce. And I think the pitfall that so many companies can fall prey to is defining e-commerce as a monolithic single thing, especially overemphasizing any single model or any single operator as the only model worth paying attention to or aligning around. That's not to say there aren't key players in the industry that account for a disproportionate share of volume or of growth, but depending on your portfolio of products and the dynamics in your category, there may be retailers that get less attention in the trade press and are discussed less often, that are really worth understanding and investing in and aligning with. And so part of our mission here today is to anchor the audience in an understanding of not every model that's worth paying attention to, but three that we think are important to understand and some of the distinctions in how you might approach them.
I agree, Keith. It's very complex, and it can't be approached as a bolt-on afterthought to an existing marketing plan.
So let's take just a moment and talk about the online grocery and CPG landscape, really in the context of what's similar and what's so different today compared to what many think back to as the Web 1.0 bubble and bust, during which venture-backed companies like Webvan and Cosmo and Pets.com are still, to this day, held up sometimes as examples of spectacular flameouts that some people argue are evidence that online grocery doesn't work or won't happen because it's been tried and didn't work in the late 90s and early 2000s. Well, I think we all can respect at that time broadband access at home was in the single digits. Smartphones, of course, didn't exist. Millennials who grew up with technology didn't really have spending power outside of their allowances. And at the time, there was far less emphasis on optimizing the operations, supply chain, and logistics of those models, and much more emphasis simply on awareness and customer acquisition. And so, thankfully, as we've seen over these last 24 months or so, very few major brands, I think, still have this mentality that it's been tried and it won't work. And as you look at the very rapid growth of pure play online retailers, as well as really well-established brick-and-mortar leaders like Walmart and Kroger leaping off the sidelines and investing in their own distinct take on e-commerce and online grocery, and even platforms that in some ways resemble retailers but don't operate as retailers, each with very different approaches to building an assortment, operating logistically, and attracting, engaging, and converting shoppers. It's just very clear. Not only is the context today very different, broadband access is orders of magnitude higher. In fact, today, smartphone penetration is closer to 75 or 80% than even 68%, and millennial spending power is immense. And so today we can all appreciate that because the market size and the addressable market for e-commerce is large and growing, and the technology that enables e-commerce is so much more sophisticated and widely adopted, we increasingly see a more segmented competitive landscape among retailers. And again, there is no single model in the current context. And as you look to the future, you can see there are even more technological and logistical changes on the horizon that are going to transform things. So we'll talk for a few minutes at the end of today's session about some of those. Just briefly, I want to emphasize, and I'm sure Richard will, how important it is as early as possible and at every level of the organization to define success. And most companies have hard objectives like sales and share, emphasizing incremental growth versus shifting volume between channels, and depending on your maturity level or capability level in e-commerce, and respecting that it's a very fast-growing and fast-evolving channel, profitability in the channel. Those tend to be where most brands start and continue to focus. But there are
And
what I
there
think
might not always be the data available to come up with the hard metrics, like the incrementality or the impact that online marketing activity might have on offline sales. And we really hope that the data availability and sharing will improve, and that'll help both retailers and manufacturers better meet shoppers' online needs.
exactly right. Yeah, and I think as many brands have had to uh, manage, regardless of what they can measure, they also look at the way the brand is presented and products are presented. I think more and more brands are thinking holistically about the impact and the influence that the digital shelf has over offline retail. Some of the ways that you can leverage online retail environments to turn loyal shoppers into brand advocates, and even just the value that supporting one of your established retailers in an area that's a key initiative for them is key. So I think we all agree it's important to define success before you dive in headlong.
Yeah, and there definitely is a brand building and relationship aspect. For example, on retailer sites that have consumer reviews and questions, there's conversations happening all the time about products, and it's important to be part of these conversations.
So, Richard, I was hoping you
yeah,
could walk us through this example.
certainly. Here's an example of a category we looked at as the impact of online and the impact on growth. This is analysis we did at one of our categories at a specific retailer. On the left is what's happening on the brick and mortar side of the business, and on the right is what's happening online. 3% of their shoppers purchased the category online, and this accounted for about 4% of category volume. Both online and offline sales were growing, with online certainly outpacing offline. When we analyzed it further, and there might be a build on here, we took a look at the category growth and that found that online contributed to 26% of the overall category growth. That's 6 times what we'd expect given its size. We've all probably seen the projections that online sales will represent up to 50% of future category growth. This example was a close-to-home illustration that it's happening now.
Absolutely. So I think every manufacturer and supplier has to go through some prioritization about where to play, and certainly that balance between scale and growth often dictates who you choose to invest aggressively in working with, where you sort of experiment, where you maintain the business, and where you carefully observe. And what we're going to get into some detail on is how you start to unpack different models and players to make some of these decisions about where to play and how to approach.
And how you approach this model will depend on your categories, brands, and regionality. For instance, our organic brands perform differently across retailers and in different parts of the United States. And it also might not be your largest brands where you want to experiment. The bigger impact and learning could come from smaller or niche brands. There are also many ways and options for experimentation and investment. It could be getting items in distribution, experimenting with different ways to influence shoppers along the path to purchase, or testing different types of packaging or pack sizes. It goes back to what we were talking about in defining the success criteria and what aligns with each brand strategy. You might want to lean in on something new for one category or brand and take more of a wait-and-see approach for another.
So let me introduce 3 distinct online formats in essence. I think these will be familiar to many, whether you've referred to them this way or not. And we'll start with spearfishing, which is not a term that I coined. It's a term that I think originates at Amazon, and it's used to describe the dynamic of shoppers who know what they want when they approach that retail model. It's a heavily search-dominated pathway to individual products. That's often a function of the endless aisle effect, millions and millions of SKUs. This is usually a national ship model, and the average order size tends to be under 2 items. Everything in these models is typically shelf stable only. And so to Richard's point, the types of items that tend to outperform in an environment with millions of SKUs, with search as the dominant pathway to products, are often niche items, items that are not widely distributed in brick and mortar, but that possess benefits, ingredients, features, some characteristic that shoppers are aware of and are looking for and can't find as widely as they'd like to. The next model you can think of as boxes. And examples of the boxes model would be operators like Boxed and the Prime Pantry format offered by Amazon. And so these tend to have single-digit or low double-digit thousands of SKUs. They're inherently limited assortments, which tends to make more mainstream, blockbuster type items a better fit. They again tend to be national, and they tend to have larger order sizes, sometimes forced by the shipping fees or parameters that the retailer actually imposes on the shopper. And if you think about the economics of a model where the average order is under 2 items versus a model where the average order is 10 items or more, there's a very different level of pressure put on any single item to be economically viable on its own. So in that first model, that spearfishing model, because people are ordering 1 or maybe 2 items in the typical order, each item has to be incredibly, it has to be economically viable by itself. And I think Richard rightly pointed out, price pack architecture, which encompasses the form of the product and the pack type and the pack size and the pack count as it relates to what you're able to charge for that product, or rather the retailer is able to charge. That's really key in a spearfishing model where each item has to be economically viable by itself. And as you transition into a boxes model, a little bit of that pressure is alleviated. So you may not need to artificially increase the pack count to offset the cost of shipping. You might be able to offer a pack size that's a little bit smaller, or a pack count that's smaller as well. And then finally, the third model is what we'll call baskets. And it's commonly referred to as a full basket model, which, in cases like Fresh Direct or Peapod or Walmart's online grocery model, Amazon Fresh, Instacart, etc., the assortment size tends to range from 15,000 to as many as 40,000 items, sometimes even more. It's inherently local, whether it's being fulfilled from local stores or from a centralized distribution center in a given metro area. The average order size tends to be larger yet again, and of course includes not only shelf-stable products, but chilled and frozen items. And so here again, the distribution, especially in a store-picked model, tends to mirror exactly the in-store assortment. In a central distribution center or fulfillment center picked model, even there you'll tend to see mainstream items, and you'll tend to see smaller pack sizes and pack counts.
Yes, it's important to understand these models and how each can be leveraged for category growth. We play in over 20 categories, and across 3 temperature states, there's a shelf-stable or ambient temperature, refrigerated, and frozen. And the mix of our business varies dramatically as we go across these models and customers. For example, the percent that our snacks business represents of our total online sales at a given retailer ranges from 19% to 62%. Now, certainly the availability to purchase and perishable food for delivery or pickup is a large factor, but even within a given format, brands perform differently depending on the market and the shopper base.
So we're gonna move quickly through a simplified way to think about the demand chain as it relates to how you might approach different retailers. And I think, again, to simplify, shoppers find or discover products, they consider them, they purchase, and ideally they love them and come back to amplify that that affinity through positive ratings and reviews. So what we want to highlight are, as you think about these different types of online formats, what levers over-index and which under-index.
And keep in mind, too, that every shopping or purchasing occasion isn't exactly the same, and what a shopper does while she's on a spearfishing site might be quite different from when she's buying a cart full of items. And there also can be starts and stops along the way, such as using a phone to add an item to a cart and then completing the purchase several days later on a laptop.
Yeah, very well said. And to emphasize Richard's point, you know, we are here together for 45 minutes trying to give you a way to think about this in a little bit of time. So, of course, you're going to want to understand in a much more nuanced way how your shoppers and how each retailer performs a little differently. But in a general sense, as we've already highlighted, a spearfishing model, a national ship model, tends to be dominated by search. In fact, you know, Amazon, just as one example, according to data from Bloomreach, is the dominant product search engine. It's surpassed even Google. So people are more often than not going directly to Amazon when they want to find a product. And that means you really need to optimize your content and carefully manage your position for highly frequently searched keywords. Secondly, you know, closely related to search is your content. So, you know, we tend to emphasize search a little more than content in a spearfishing model, only because if you don't focus on search, you won't get the page views that you need. But they're so closely related, you can't decouple those. Price pack architecture is important nowhere else more than in these models for the reasons we described. You know, the pendulum always swings between unfettered growth and balance on growth and unit economics. But we hear from many suppliers at the moment the pendulum is swinging towards unit economics, and that means you have to be increasingly thoughtful about all of those price pack architecture considerations in this model. The final point I'll emphasize is the importance of relentless focus on on-shelf availability, particularly in these national ship models. While, you know, from a supply chain point of view, they have different fulfillment centers, and your forecasting and replenishment it involves different touch points. It tends to be much more manageable and easier to impact in this model than it is when it's an inherently local model, particularly the store-picked models. And, you know, if you think about the implications of out of stocks, most retailers in a spearfishing national ship model penalize a product when it's out of stock. So an out of stock item is unlikely to show up on the first page of a search result if it's displayed at all. And secondly, it doesn't matter how well you execute in areas like search and content. You've done great pricing and promotions, merchandising, marketing. It doesn't matter how well you execute in any of those areas. If shoppers can't buy, you lose. So we tend to encourage you to really emphasize that fundamental of on-shelf availability in this model, both because it's more realistic to impact it effectively in this model, and it has such huge impacts on your performance.
I agree.
So I'm going to move through the mechanics of findability, but I think everybody can appreciate each retailer has its own unique search algorithm. Some are more predictably influenced than others. The simple performance feedback loop that I think many are familiar with is you have to identify the frequently searched terms shoppers are using when they're looking for products like yours. And that sets up where the eyeballs are. And once you know where the eyeballs are, you want to position really favorably. And because so few shoppers will click past the first page, you want to be on page one. And because most clicks accrue to the products at the top of that page, you want to be as close to the first 3 or 5 positions as you can be. And so part of what you want to measure and part of what you want to optimize are areas like your title and your bullets and descriptions and much more, so that you are continuously monitoring and refining your position.
Yeah. And what's fascinating to me is how much search terms vary by category and brand. For some of our categories, the generic or category name is most often used, while for others, the brand name is used most often. There's even some of our products that, if you take a look at the top 5 search terms that are used, it's a mix of category terms and brand terms.
And I think that's such an important point. And we would coach anybody. One, you must know what that mix is. Two, you want to manage your positioning for both types of terms. When someone searches for your brands, 100% or as close to it of the items on that first results page should be your products. And when you're setting targets for unbranded search terms or generic terms, think of your fair share as a benchmark for the share of page one results that ought to be yours. And it varies by brand and by category, but that's a way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we introduced this concept of price pack architecture briefly, and I emphasize it in the context of the national ship spearfishing model, again, because I think when I think of the most sophisticated and advanced suppliers that I've worked with, many of whom have been deeply involved in understanding the demand chain of working with spearfishing retailers, the attention is increasingly on the economics in the supply chain. And price pack architecture has implications for both demand, to the extent that what you're able to charge a consumer is a factor, but most of this has to do with some of the fundamentals, like what form is the product in, what primary and secondary packaging is involved. So for example, exploring for some of your high volume items programs like Amazon's frustration-free packaging or shipping in its own container is a way to think about how packaging can play a role. The pack type, is it a box or a bag or a pouch, can play a role in the sense that the form factor itself, is it an irregular shape? That has implications for space utilization in a truck. And then, of course, pack size and pack count and how aligned those are or are not with consumer preference, as well as how those impact the ability to offset the cost of handling and delivering the product. All of that becomes really key. And we see more and more manufacturers involving their counterparts from R&D, new product development, supply chain, reverse engineering in some cases, new product innovation, and price pack architecture that ultimately lets them charge more because the product is more effective or more convenient to use, and has a form, packaging, and is in configurations that can be sold profitably for all stakeholders.
Yeah, I think this has the potential of reframing how people think about the long tail of the endless aisle, especially when it comes to food that has more of a finite shelf life. You can't hold the slow-moving products in inventory forever.
So let's talk for a minute about the boxes model. And boxes, as we've already said, sort of sits halfway between the spearfishing national ship model and the local full basket model. And I think the most important thing to emphasize here is while price pack architecture matters, inherent in the larger average order size, you've obviously got less pressure on any individual item to be economically viable. So what we see most commonly in the boxes model is a focus on larger pack sizes, sometimes bulk packs, but less pressure to force bundles or to force multi-packs than you might see in a national ship model. The other key distinction is a more balanced emphasis between search, your positioning in the navigation, category and department placement, and favorites or past orders. So as we'll see as we go into the full basket discussion, unlike the national ship model, which does tend to skew really heavily toward search, the larger the order, the likelier shoppers are to be browsing through the retailer's taxonomy, which means as a supplier, understanding where you fit is key, and influencing where you fit is key. And it also means that there becomes a big benefit to making that list the first time. In other words, it's almost an annuity that pays out over time because the inertia and the momentum that builds to the items that have been ordered in the past can be really significant. And content becomes really critical, particularly in the consideration stage, as well as, of course, to the extent that it impacts findability and search results. But assuming you're attracting the right shoppers and the right eyeballs, you really want to focus on representing products accurately in a compelling way so that the shoppers are converted to buyers. And from a findability point of view, what we call above the fold fields, like titles and primary images and bullets and short form descriptions, have a tendency to have the biggest impact on findability. But then other fields, particularly in high involvement, highly considered categories, fields like ingredients and nutrition, and even richer content like product comparison matrices or benefit comparison matrices within a family of products, can have huge impacts on conversion and can help justify higher price points in premium products.
Yes, we spend a lot of time making sure that we have the right content and images across our portfolio, both internally and also externally to publish. And this is no small task with over 2,000 items available across the United States alone.
And again, briefly, we'll emphasize here again the importance of staying in stock. And for the same reasons that in the spearfishing national ship model, on-shelf availability is just essential in the boxes model. And it's for the same reasons. One, because these are national models, you have fewer points of presence in the retailers, distribution centers, and fulfillment centers, which means collaboratively planning and forecasting and replenishing your items is just more transparent and manageable. And secondly, while this data from the FMI and GMA does not relate specifically to the online channel, I think it's a great reminder of the importance of being in stock, because the first time you're out of stock, shoppers are likely to substitute a competing product, but the second time they may lapse in the category, and the third time they may even lapse from that retailer. And so what begins as a small problem for you as the supplier can quickly turn into a big problem for you as the supplier and even for your retailer.
I suspect there'd be similar results if we asked about the online shopping experience. If it's easy to find products they're looking for, either through search and navigation, put them in a cart and pay for them, shoppers will return. But if it's continually one frustration after another, then they'll stop using it and look for a better way.
Okay. So we'll talk for a minute about the full basket model. And again, all of these areas that we've emphasized continue to be important, simply in varying degrees of importance here. And so what I would emphasize are two areas here, one of which is the favorites list. And so favorites are just to reiterate, the list of items that you've purchased in the past. And sometimes these can be loaded from a brick and mortar retailer's loyalty program. So it's very challenging in a predictable way to get on that list. But if you're working with one of these operators, you want to really understand, particularly on the promotional and marketing side, how you can drive awareness of your category and certainly of your product, because that ultimately triggers that first order, which has such long-term benefits.
Influence shoppers along the path to purchase is an area that needs to evolve and where we continue to have a lot of learning. There are some good vehicles and tools today, but there's so much more that can be done. For example, meal solutions work well because displaying products across temperature states, the problem you have in store doesn't exist online, so you can bundle different products together. And we've also found that portfolio events that go across several categories to meet a shopper's needs, such as back-to-school snacks, are quite effective. We've also found that multi-brand events that include free delivery also work well. And on those occasions when shoppers are looking for inspiration instead of just completing the task of purchasing what they want to, recipes are a great way to engage the shopper. And there are several ways to accomplish this. You can either have the recipe first and make it easy to add the needed ingredients to their cart, or if they're interested in a particular item, you can offer up recipe ideas for them to use the product a little bit differently. And one advancement in full basket along the path to purchase I was pleased to see was the recent announcement that some retailers are partnering with the USDA to pilot SNAP online ordering and payment.
Okay, so I know we've moved pretty quickly through first at a high level trying to articulate some of the ways that suppliers are defining success for not any single e-commerce model, but all of them, and defining not every e-commerce model, but at least three that are increasingly important to suppliers in diverse categories. And then thirdly, walking through some of the levers on both the demand chain and on the supply chain that are more effective or less effective depending on a given model. And as I hope everybody took out of the discussion, this is a general overview. Of course, things vary based on your portfolio and your objectives and which retailer within any of these models you might be working with. But we hope it's a way to start thinking about how you might engage. And as you look into the future and start paying attention to where the change is likely to come from, certainly pay attention to the retailers themselves, especially those that may not be large scale but are fast growing and are doing something interesting or innovative. Those may fall into the experiment and innovate quadrant, if you recall the slide from earlier in our presentation. But even outside of any individual retailer or operator, you can start to unpack some of the technology-driven areas that impact the way retailers and other players in the consumer landscape attract shoppers, get their attention or keep their attention, how they lock shoppers in through membership or subscription programs. And one area I hope everybody pays very close attention to is the environments and the touch points that are transactable. Because on the demand chain side of where our industry is headed, I think we're going through at least one major step change in interface. That is, whether it's voice or whether it's voice and augmented reality, it may be both. Every time there is a rotation in the user interface, in the mode of interaction between a shopper and companies like retailers, there are new winners and losers. And so pay very close attention to how quickly those technologies are adopted and which specific technologies are being adopted. And then on the supply chain side, there's all kinds of things, some of which are more probable than others and will happen sooner than others, but all of which, if and when they happen, have huge impacts and implications on economics in our industry, especially for the full basket online grocery business model. There's just no question. The two biggest cost drivers are the expense of picking, packing, and staging orders, whether for collection or delivery. And in the case of delivery, the labor and the fuel expense of that delivery. So if you look at things like autonomous vehicles and energy efficient vehicles, there's a lot of admittedly speculative developments on the horizon. But if you work for a brand that is looking 5 or 10 years into the future, pay attention to these developments. You don't need to do anything, but you should pay attention.
Yep. It's amazing how rapidly it's evolving too. There's new companies and new models starting all the time, and each one has the potential of enabling a tipping point for a given category.
So I thank everybody for joining us. I think, just to summarize everything we've covered, define success. That should start at executive levels or at least be endorsed at executive levels. You want to understand why and how shoppers shop different online formats distinctly, understand what drives results in different contexts. You must measure whatever you intend to manage, and this is all a journey. So, of course, you want to benchmark competitors and outperformers, but we encourage every brand to compete primarily with themselves. And your objective should be to be better today than you were yesterday. So with that, thanks again to Richard for all of his expertise and partnership preparing today's presentation, and I'll turn it over to Sarah, who will explain the Q&A process.
Yeah, very big thank you to Richard and to Keith for the presentation. I've been compiling a list of some of the most interesting questions, and I'm going to hand it back over to you, Keith and Richard, to answer some of the most interesting questions. So yeah, thanks again, and back over to you, Keith.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. A few housekeeping questions. One is, will we be sharing the deck? I know the answer is yes. Another was, is the session being recorded? Sarah, I think it is. Do you mind chiming in?
Yeah, so the session is being recorded. The presentation will also be available, and I will send both of those to you early next week.
Perfect. Okay. So another question was, in our experience, what are the most reliable sources to determine the priority search terms for specific categories? Richard, do you have any perspective to share on that one?
There are a few companies you can work with, third parties, that can capture that through a separate panel, but through Amazon's Vendor Central, you can take a look at the top search terms for at least that site. And then it relies on working with individual retailers to determine and find out what the key search terms are on their sites.
Yeah, that I would echo exactly what Richard said. Some retailers have done a great job establishing self-service analytics portals that make it easy to go do a little bit of research for that specific retailer. Others have premium services that they offer, often in partnership with a third party, that are specific to that retailer. And then, as Richard notes, there are third-party behavioral panel operators that are monitoring horizontally across many retailers with a panel of shoppers. And I think that's probably the most broadly applicable option if you're trying not to project any single retailer's dynamic to all of your retailers. So another question we got was partly a comment, partly a question. Favorites seem to have the largest variance between the three models. As subscription options advance across retailers, how can you influence a shopper's willingness to participate in these programs without specifically targeting just one retailer? And I think it's a great question. The retailers that are furthest along in offering the subscription model have tended to create more opportunities for suppliers to participate in awareness and trial promotions. So, for example, subsidizing the subscription for either an indefinite or a definite period of time, or subsidizing other aspects of the transaction. I think, as in other areas, being agnostic and running where to buy, or in this case, where to subscribe, either campaigns or simply making that information accessible wherever you can, is a good idea, although not one that I've seen many brands investing in across retailers. Most of what I've seen has been retailer by retailer. Richard, do you have any thoughts on how to influence shoppers' willingness to participate in subscription programs independent of any one retailer?
Yeah, and it'll certainly vary by the shopper group. For example, new moms, it could be that diapers, getting those on an easy replenishment cycle, could be the gateway category. But for an elderly shopper or somebody who lives in the inner city, it could be a totally different category. So you have to find out what are those gateway categories to go on a type of click it and forget it, and also what their barriers are.
Perfect. Well, appreciate everybody's time today. Thanks for attending. Sarah will be back to you with some of the logistical follow-ups. But thanks all for joining us today. Sarah, back to you.
Great, yeah, thank you very much, Keith and Richard, for the really insightful presentation. Just so that everyone is aware, once again, I will send you the recordings and presentations as soon as it's downloaded and ready to go. So that will be hopefully on Monday of next week. So yeah, thanks for all your questions and comments at the end as well. If anyone has any further questions that they'd like to pose to Richard or Keith, you could send me an email and I can forward on those questions to them. Or if anyone has any questions directly for me, that's also fine. So thank you everyone again for joining us and for all your contributions. Just so that everyone is also aware, I will be hosting a series of webinars throughout the year. So if you're interested in hearing more about similar topics to do with winning at the digital shelf, then keep an eye out for my regular emails. And of course, I hope that you'll all be able to join us at the 3rd Annual Online and Digital Grocery Summit, which will be taking place in November 2017 in Chicago. More details can be found at www.digitalgrocerysummit.com, or you can email me directly to get more information. So thanks again, and hope to see everyone at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.